waiting for it to switch here. All right. Welcome, everybody, to Essentials Credentials Podcast, Episode 2. Today, I'm joined by Greg.
What's going on?
And Rodney.
What's up?
And today, we're going to be talking about the 90s market and how it has changed over the last 20-plus years. And we're also going to provide you with a couple examples of our personal cards that kind of reflect that 90s market. So, like I said, we're joined by Rodney today, who is his first time on the podcast. Rodney, how did you get into collecting 90s?
Well, when I was a kid, I loved baseball, so I didn't actually have cable. So it was odd for me because I had to read about players doing well in the newspaper box scores. So specifically, when I was in like third or fourth grade, I started having at least some access to the internet, and naturally, I found Griffey all the way on the West Coast. I started following him, but I wouldn't be able to see how he did until 2 days later because the West Coast games didn't travel over to Louisville, Kentucky until 2 days later. So naturally, I had one of my best friends. He also loved baseball, and he started collecting cards. So he and I started going to flea markets back in the 93, 94, and we would start to buy packs. We both had our favorite players, like Griffey. He loved Tony Gwynn. And then from that started just my obsession with baseball card collecting, well, and Griffey in general. So throughout the 90s, I continued to, follow the market as the new products came out. And I think around like the early 2000s, that's when I started to go. That was right around when I started high school. So my interest in the hobby wasn't really as high as it was when I was, in grade school. And then same in college. I didn't have any money in college.
Right.
Nobody did.
Yeah, exactly. So then after college, I still had my collection. I never sold anything off. And I started looking up, what is this card that I wanted when I was a kid as a 90? What is it at now? And it was still pretty cheap. And so I'd get cards here and there. And then as the 2010s decade rolled around, I started to have a little bit more, disposable income. And I was able to start getting cards that I really, really wanted as a kid growing up in the 90s. I just didn't even dream of owning. But then, of course, that coincided with how the market changed. So, and I guess
definitely.
That's one of the points is like I started in the 90s, took a little lull in the 2000s. And then when I came back by late 2000s, early 2010s, it was, I guess, a good time to get back in the hobby because cards were still pretty reasonable,
right,
compared to now, to where a lot of 90s cards, especially of the star players or even the semi-stars, are a lot higher.
No, go ahead, Greg.
I'm doing some research. I was looking in 2009, 2010. It seems like that was still a good time to buy cards where there was a small uptick, but for the most part, they were still kind of unrecognized. So you could fly under the radar with a lot of those and get a good deal.
Well, you said something, Rodney, that I think speaks to a lot of us, that all of our friends that collect 90s, is we are able to get these cards that while we were kids were dreams to own. I think there's a certain vanity with these 90s cards because of that. Greg and I have talked about this before, and we've all talked about this, how isn't it amazing that I'm holding this card that I remember seeing in Beckett, and it was like $150 or whatever. And there's like, yep, I'm never going to own that card, but wouldn't it be cool someday? And here we are all this time later, and we're able to achieve that, which is, I think it's pretty cool. I think it's why 90s are pretty unique in that sense.
Mm-hmm. And, Greg, you brought up a good point about, in 2010, it was still a little bit reasonable to buy cards of any player from the 90s. That speaks to, I guess, the history of, if we're talking about 90s trends, what is the history of the trends from the 90s to where we are today? And, right, from the 90s all the way to the late 90s, I think that's when those cards, when they first came out, they were at their peak, just like when any product comes out, they're pretty high. And then right around 2000, like 2000 to 2002, you started to have the shift in the hobby's focus from inserts and parallels that were numbered low to game used and autos or game used autos. And that started a shift of people focusing on, rather than going after that high end insert or parallel like a precious metal gems or even a cut above from EX 2000. You would go after, oh, I want to get a jersey card or a bat card or a glove card. Oh, it's auto too? Or what if about this auto? Because in the 90s, those are even more rare than they were, in the 2000s. Yep. And then like 2003 to 2006, I think that was the lowest time that I've noticed prices on 90s cards. I collect Griffey, and I remember I was like checking, like, what is for example, I remember this vividly. In 2003, there was a 97 totally certified platinum gold Griffey. Those are numbered to 30. And there was a seller on eBay that had it listed for $300. Buy it now. And I remember watching this for multiple weeks and no one bought. That card today, I mean, if anybody saw that today, it would be the fastest buy it now clip ever.
Absolutely. In the history of eBay, yes, absolutely.
And that's the thing is like from that time of like 2003 to 2006, that was when we were in the hobby. It was full-fledged game used autos.
Yeah.
And rather than on inserts and parallels. And then from like that point to 2010, I mean, I think that's when a lot of the players that we collect started to retire.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they were still relevant, but we were like, oh, wow, these guys they're nearing the ends of their careers. And that's when the market, I feel like, started to get saturated with that. A lot of the products out there were so many card products. SP, Upper Deck put out jersey products, like maybe it's seeming like every week. So that's when like kind of the flood started to move back to the 90s. And then 2010, like you said, Greg, 2010 to maybe 2014, that's when it was still cheap, but people were starting to go back.
Yeah, and people were picking up on that around that time, for sure.
Yeah. And another example I have right around 2012, so in that period of 2010 to 2014, I remember there was a Griffey starting 9 that was listed on eBay. And in 2012, it sold for like $980. And at the time, I'm thinking, wow, that's really expensive. There's only 9 of those. And I've never even seen a starting 9 before that. If I think about that card hitting the market now, it would go for at least double, possibly triple, maybe even more. Yeah. And that was just in 2012, which was 7 years ago. So if you go from 2014 to 2019, where we are now, present day, a lot of the stars from the 90s are retired. They're still relevant, whether it's on baseball, TV, commercials, ambassadors for the game. Mm-hmm. Some of them made the Hall of Fame. And then you also had the bumps from the PSA grading. Gem mint copies of any card from the 90s receive bumps. Refractors are really, really popular right now. But Hall of Fame bumps for those guys that made it. You have all of these factors within the last 5 years, in addition to the fact that the players from the 90s were so popular. And I mean, I think that's like encompasses the history of where we're standing from the 90s to where we are today.
Well, I think two key points are a lot of the 90s guys are being represented in the stuff today. So you'll see Panini or Topps that have Griffey and Frank Thomas, and you have a 101 super refractor of Frank Thomas. And so they're staying relevant and they're staying in people's minds. So that goes back to, oh, I got this Frank Thomas 101 super refractor. I remember the 99 platinum medallion. And so it stays relevant. And then I also think the PSA registry kind of helps, where people will get gem mints of like a Topps 95, just a common base 95 Topps that's a gem mint, and it's worth so many PSA registry points. So I think all these things kind of make those players stay relevant in people's minds, as well as the forums and Facebook where they're talking and showing off their collections. And so it's just like, it's one of those things where you say there is no such thing as bad, it's just staying relevant in people's minds. And that's what kind of,
I think those are two great points, because you start thinking about, okay, so this is what happened, the history of the 90s trends. And now you're starting thinking about what were the causes? Like, what were the reasons for these changes? And the PSA registry is a great example, because that started really kicking in around maybe like mid 2000s. And like you also said, the relevance of the stars that are still being made in products in 2017, 2018. I know Griffey's still there, pumping out autos.
Yeah.
When you have a player that stays for that longevity, and it's not just Griffey, it's A-Rod, it's Thomas, it's Ripken, it's like lesser known star like Ron Gant, Eddie Murray still has inserts there. Even like retired players from the mid 90s, like Don Mattingly has autographs. You're gonna think, you're like, wow, these guys are still relevant. So
no, for sure,
I think that definitely makes you want to get older cards when something like that like kickstarts your memory, and you're like, oh, Don Mattingly, I remember Don Mattingly, and then you go back and get like a statistical standout of Don Mattingly. So I think there's always going to be that connection there where the players now in these current sets kind of help with that 90s market as well.
Well, I have a little something that came to my mind when you talked about the starting 9, Rodney. I, like Greg, we talked about before, kind of dabbled in the modern cards right around 2009, 2010, just for a little bit. And I remember, watching pack openings, box openings online, and a card out of 9 was kind of cool, but everybody was chasing the 1-on-1s and the jersey autos and all this, like you were saying. So it's funny that I remember getting into the 90s market right around that time and seeing these lower numbered Griffies. And it's almost like people thought, okay, a card out of 50, well, that's kind of cool. But in modern days, if we're comparing it, a fifth card out of 50 means nothing, there really is no value. So it's almost like it took them a while to discover the value in that rare of a card. And now you look at now and geez, that card, like you said, would be massively higher than it was back then. So that definitely came to mind. And of course, it's sad to say this, but Griffey's last year in Seattle did not go well. It was like, a month, and he was hitting like 100. So that would have been the perfect time for you to hop in there and grab just about every card you wanted, because his value was about as low as you could possibly go. And I don't think it's been that low ever since then. So yeah, a couple things that came to mind.
Matt, you and Greg bring up 2 good points too first about how if you're like you were talking about Don Mattingly, statistical standouts. If you're seeing him produce or seeing on-card autos of him, or maybe not on-card autos, maybe they're sticker autos.
Yeah, right.
In like mid to 2015, 2016, and then you're thinking to yourself, well, what did he put out in the 90s, like back when he was actually still playing? Like that's I guess maybe an unconscious thing that people think like, oh, if he's still getting if I want to get an auto of modern day now, let's go back to the cards from his playing days. And I think that's also a big reason about why the 90s cards have still stayed relevant and have jumped so much in price. And I think that's important to think. And then Matthew, you said about the part about the rarity. So
right.
When I think about like what caused all of not all of, just Topps and Panini to put out colored refractors that are numbered to 20, 15, 10, 5, 1. And you see now Panini like numbers cards numbered to 3 to 2 to 1 to 4 to 5. And I mean, part of that reason is because in the 90s, when cards were printed to 50 or 25 or even 10, and then they created the masterpieces in 97, that was so rare. That actually was legit rarity. And then because there was such high demand, and then card companies went under because of the demand. People we want more product. We want more product. Well, Don Russell's Pinnacle went bankrupt because they put out more product to try and meet demand, but the product wasn't good. So they went under. Fleer went bankrupt in 2005. Pacific went bankrupt in 2000. And then you're left with Upper Deck, Topps, and Upper Deck and Topps.
Yeah, right.
And then they got the monopoly, later on in the late 2000s. But what the card companies did was, we want to meet demand. So what we started doing was making it a hit-driven mentality, which is what you see now in box breaks. Whereas in the 90s, everybody wanted the hit. They would buy a box. They wouldn't get a hit. They'd be disappointed. Now card companies, they want a hit-driven. They want to meet the demand of the hits. Yeah. So then they're forced almost to create cards that are numbered to 10, 5, 15, 20, 25, so that people, when they buy a box, they don't feel like they are not returning on their investment, even though by doing so, that I call it artificial rarity is created.
Yeah.
That exists in the modern. In the 90s, you had a card that was numbered to 50. There's usually no parallel version of that refractor that's numbered to 50, for example. It's just that, and that's it. So I think that is another reason why the 90s stay really relevant in the card. People want those cards.
Well, nowadays you got your guaranteed hits. You buy a box and you got your guaranteed hits. I remember in the 90s, I bought a box and I was like, man, I hope I just get a cool Frank Thomas. Like, that's all I wanted, just something cool. And I'd open my packs and, 36 packs, maybe 24 packs. You get 1 out of 36 card and you're like just stoked. You get a few Frank Thomas base, some Griffey, some trade bait for your friends. And that was a good day. You had a good box. And now I see people complaining like, I only got 1 autograph in my box, or this jersey is just plain white. And back then, like a white napkin patch of a jersey was like a godsend. You're like, look at this white little patch that Griffey wore. The most amazing thing I've ever seen. And now you're like, oh, it's just a white patch. It doesn't have any color on it. Garbage. So they mass produce this stuff, but because people want those hits. Like, you see the hits are autos and patches, and everybody has them now. So it's a way different market than it was in the 90s, where you were just happy to get a gold medallion of a thunderclap. Like that was rarities. That was when the market was a good place.
I was telling Greg this before, Rodney. I dabbled in opening 90s boxes and writing reviews for them. I don't know if any of you guys have been on was it Retro Baseball Breaks, I think was the name of the blog or something. It's up there on the internet if you look it up. But or Old School Wax, that was it. So I used to like go in and write reviews and break 90s boxes, and it was really fun to change my expectations going into a 90s box as compared to opening a modern product, because I remember opening a product from 2010 and not getting my 4 guaranteed hits. And it was like, what the heck, I wasted all this money. Whereas when I opened a box of, I think my first one was 99 Ultra, I paid $25 for it and I had no expectations going in. And it was exciting just to get an insert. And it reminded me of being a kid, when you open those boxes, like, hey, if you get a card that nowadays is cheap, back then it was still really exciting. So it's definitely, the card designs nowadays, the way they're doing it is completely changed the game, like you said, for sure.
Yeah, and to both of your points about card design in the 90s, I think another reason for the popularity of those cards is because that was when we started first seeing, the refractor was introduced in 93, and then I don't know when the first embossed refractor or embossed like die cut card. I mean, you could say 97 Finest, but you had refractors, different refractor patterns. You had die cuts. You had cards that looked like a baseball, like 95 Statistical Standouts, referencing that again. You had cards that looked like a glove, 94 Flare Hot Gloves.
Awesome set.
The innovation from the 90s was the first time that a lot of us were seeing what we still see put out today. We see a card that's die cut look like a glove, or a foul pole net from Pacific, or you get cards that have a refractor pattern like from 98 Atomic, Bowman's Best. Like that is the first, they call that cracked ice now, but originally was an Atomic refractor from 98. Yep. You have the Hyperply design from 97 Finest or Bowman's Best. That was originally in the Atomic refractor design. So like the card innovations, or the novelty, like putting a piece of jersey patch on the card, was the first time that we saw that. And when it first hit the market, it just blew our minds.
Yeah.
But then the genesis of that, card companies saw, well, we need to put more of these out there to meet the demand. And then it cost, it came at the expense of rarity, if you will. And then related to that are the card designs, or just the innovation of, the insert packs. I'm sorry, I already talked about the innovation. When you had a card that was, like you mentioned, the 96 Thunderclap Gold Medallion, Greg, I don't know what that is off the top of my head. It's a lot. I think a regular Thunderclap was 1 in 72, and I think a Gold Medallion was maybe 1 in close to 1,000 packs. But yeah,
I want to say that's from Series 1 Ultra, right? Yeah, 96.
the 96 hitting machines, those are 1 in 288, and then the
man, those are awesome.
1 in 2,880. So when you think about that too, it had to take that many packs to just get one, theoretically, and then you had to get one of your player. You just times that by the number of people that are in the set. So yeah, if I just got a gold medallion from 95 or 96 Fleer Ultra of Paul O'Neill, who's like a semi-star back then, I'd be like, oh yeah, okay, and then I can trade it to my friends, like you said, Greg.
Yeah. That is a great point. I mean, it's totally different, man. I think people modern days, they value cards so differently than we ever did.
Yeah.
I mean, come on, let's be honest. Pulling a base when you were a kid of your favorite player was amazing. You know, I mean, pulling. I told this in the last episode. I just saying, like, pulling a Joey Cora. Nobody in the world cares about Joey Cora still, but I still do. So I remember pulling a Joey Cora at base, and I think I got more excited about that than I ever did opening a modern box when I did that. Like a LeBron James jersey I pulled. I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Like, can you imagine like pulling a Griffey jersey? I mean, it would have been a totally different reaction. So it's definitely different.
Also, like when you're watching a break right now, it's like base, hit. Whereas in the 90s, you're like, you look at your first card, you're like, oh, I got a Griffey, sweet. Oh, Tony Gwynn. Like, you were looking at them, you were examining them. It was just a slower paced. And I don't know if that has something to do with just our mentality now, where we always need to be stimulated. Our attentions are shorter. But I remember slowly going through. It would take me a while to open a box of cards because I wanted to just enjoy them. I wanted to look at them. I might even be putting my Griffey or my Frank Thomas in a top loader, and then putting it down and putting the Gwynn in the top loader and then moving on. But it felt slower, and it felt more of a methodical approach to opening a box, whereas you see guys just like sorting through to get to the auto. It kind of feels greedy. It kind of feels like, I don't know, they're not appreciating the way we opened cards. But it's a different mentality now.
Yeah. Rodney, did you get a chance to open some boxes back when you were a kid at all, or did you try doing that, later on once you were able to start picking up some Griffies and so forth?
Oh, I never opened boxes. I would always dream of. I think I had to like ask my parents, who they bought me baseball cards. Just the fact that they spend like $10 on a baseball card at 95 for me is something that I'm very fortunate and appreciative of, because I didn't, I guess, fully understand the concept of money back then. But boxes back in the 90s were like $150.
Yep.
So I could never dream to own it. So I was just like, I would always buy the base cards.
Yeah.
Yep.
So a base card of Griffey would be $3 and a normal brand back then in the 90s. And then that's what I would start my collection with, because that's the only thing that I could, that's what I could collect. And, it kind of relates to a point. I think another reason for the 90s trend, or for the 90s market increasing as it has been for the past decade, is because in the 90s, it was so star driven. Like the hobby, there were so many stars. And if you look back now, these guys are getting into the Hall of Fame. And you have all of those players who were like the face of the game. Like Griffey transcended, into pop culture. Frank Thomas did the same thing. Mike Piazza, Derek Jeter, Chipper Jones, Tony Gwynn, all of these guys were beyond baseball. They did other things, and they were still kind of relevant in pop culture. And it was not as strong as, let's say, the 90s market or the 90s players in basketball, because, gosh, the 90s players in basketball, like, those are some of the greatest players ever. Like that's when you had the Dream Team. And in baseball, it wasn't as, you didn't have like the Barkley, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, etc., all playing at once. But Griffey, Thomas, Jeter, A-Rod, Juan Gonzalez, Chipper Jones, Piazza, Bonds. Bonds. That's pretty.
McGuire,
Sosa, and that brings another point. In the '98 home run race, regardless of what you thought about it, regardless of what you thought about it, that captivated the entire country, and that like brought baseball back. Everybody says that saved baseball, and I wouldn't disagree with that. But in '94, '95, after the strike, it was pretty low. But that change, when it goes beyond pop culture, anything, it's going to be reflected in memorabilia, whether that's like an autographing card or like a glove. or baseball cards. So, I mean, in the height of 98 home run race and right afterwards, and even in 2001 when Barry Bonds was chasing, broke the records, those cards were still hot.
Yep. Well, and I have a Beckett from 2000, and I every time when I look through it, you look at those, every one of those players that you mentioned, McGuire, Sosa, let's see, Juan Gonzalez, A-Rod, Jeter, of course, Griffey, Tony Gwynn, Nomar, Jeter, all these great 90s players. I mean, their cards were at a premium. I think McGuire is priced higher than A-Rod at this point, which is kind of interesting because you look now and some of that has changed.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned guys getting to the Hall of Fame. There's a bunch of great players that, in the steroids eras, they call it, that are not in the Hall of Fame. But can you imagine if they ever do, what that's going to do to the market? I mean, that's going to drastically change it even more, in my opinion.
Well, in the 90s, around this time when we're heavily collecting, there was games, magazines, and TV, basically. So a lot of these stars had commercials, like you guys were saying. A lot of them were in pop culture, movies, but they were kind of forced in our faces, whether for good or bad, but they were there. So you saw them everywhere. Newspapers, you saw them. Nowadays, you got the internet. You've got people who can just be so encompassed in like Fortnite, watching Fortnite videos on the internet. Like they don't know anything about the news, sports, just doing YouTube, playing their games. There's so many more distractions now that I feel like a reason we like these players so much is because whether or not we wanted to, they were just forced upon us, and we had to kind of just know about, people talked about them, ESPN. We didn't have as many avenues for our attention that these players became like entrenched and stuck in our heads. And we liked it because obviously we're here. So it magnified it so much more. Whereas nowadays, if you don't have to watch it, you don't have to be notified, you don't have to know about these players, and that's fine because you can do your own thing. But back then, it made it so much more valuable to us seeing these players, and then us getting to collect them made it awesome as well. So I think it's just like nowadays things are so much different for people that we hang on to this, and that's how we grew up. So these players that we're collecting just mean so much more because we had so much more exposure to them.
Yeah,
that's a great point.
Yeah, because when you have a lot of, I guess, YouTube doesn't existed in the 90s, or if it did, I just wasn't aware of it.
It did not, no.
Yeah. And when you have different avenues to go down and learn more about an interest or a hobby that you have, then you have that outlet or that avenue or social media, that media to go down. Whereas, in baseball, if you like baseball, it was ESPN, because MLB Network wasn't even around. You had ESPN, you had memorabilia, you had cards, and then you had news and pop culture. And like you said, that made it a little bit more concentrated.
Right.
Yeah. And then speaking to the part about
I was just gonna say, like, do you remember Baseball Weekly? Like going to the newsstand and seeing like May 2nd through May 14th. And so you got the Baseball Weekly for $2, I think, and you're just going through like reading what they did from the last week and the stats, and it was an amazing time. I loved Baseball Weekly. It was awesome.
And now you have so many more outlets, so it's like you don't have that necessarily that one thing that everyone gets. Yeah. Whether it's a Beckett in the mail every month or a Sports Weekly, or you had so many periodicals that talked about baseball cards, like Tough Stuff, Sports Cards, all that beyond the Beckett. And then we're talking a lot about like our experiences in the 90s. So I think another reasoning for these trends of 90s cards going upward is we grew up in the 90s. Whatever reason you stayed or you did a lull in maybe the 2000s for life reasons, and then you're coming back and you have a little bit more disposable income, and you're saying, hey, I want to get that card that I wanted back when I was younger. That's something that I've read about over the forums at FCB and Blowout, back in like 2010. That's when I first started joining those areas or those social media platforms. I never really thought about it, but it made sense. When you have people who grew up in an era, who really enjoyed that era, and something that is a remembrance from that era, baseball cards, and then you combine that with that natural interest that doesn't go away over time, with extra cash in your wallet or your bank account, then it's a very easy thing to do. I'm going to buy that 1996 Flair Diamond Cuts of Mike Piazza that I saw in 1996 at a card show in a mall that was probably like $15. And I had to either ask my mom or dad to buy it, or if maybe some people who were savvy enough and already were dealing cards back then, they still had to pay $15 for it. Whereas a decade later, that card is still probably $2. Right. And it's like, why not? But then it's not just the low end cards. You start buying the more high end cards, or those cards that are numbered lower, like cool design or a combination of both. So when you get those guys who never really left the hobby, or guys or girls that never left the hobby, coming back with more spending power, then that's going to cause a drive up in prices in the market. And it just happens slowly over time from like 2010 to where we are now.
Well, just like with vintage, people still value that and they go back to it. It's for our generation where now the cards that we just set in our head is like we'll never own, like you were saying, we now have income to own these cards, and now it's like a dream, like, oh, I remember I just wanted this card so bad. So now we're bored, we got our life set, we need a hobby, we got some extra cash, and it creates like happiness for us, so we get these cards. And I think that's kind of what's driving the 90s era right now, is us as a generation are wanting these cards that we could never own as kids.
Well, and you have a point here that I think goes right into that, Rodney, that you have here, and that's the hype that we're generating by even us doing this right now. If I may say so, I think if we really focus on certain cards on this, we will probably drive the price of these cards up just a little bit the more and more we talk about them. So that's what all these online forums have done. And I joined Blowout, the forums, at around 2010 as well, before I got into 90s baseball. And man, once those threads started going crazy, I mean, the prices of those cards also started going up. I mean, it's just, people are bringing light to these cards that people forgot about. I mean, I right off the top of my head, I can tell you, there's like the hitting machines of Griffey. I didn't even know that card existed back when I collected because it was so expensive. And I remember seeing one for the first time, like, I need to get back into 90s. I believe it was that card. And then it was an A-Rod, the statistical standouts, the glove that folds out from Leaf.
Yeah.
I mean, those are the two cards I remember seeing them, and it was like, oh my gosh, that's right, I should go check these out. And then it was just the rabbit hole, man. Found those two cards, and then I found about 1,000 more that were unique and, numbered and die cut and so forth. So I think that's a huge reason.
Well, how easy is it for this to happen? You get on the forum or get in the Facebook group, and somebody posts an amazing Barry Bonds, and you're like, I never knew that card existed. Go to eBay, beep, 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 beep. And then you look up your player, and you're like, oh, $20, I'm going to get that card. And so, or even just doing the research to look to see if that card exists for your player. It's so easy nowadays because everything's at our fingertips. So all somebody has to do is bring to light one card, and then you get 10 people looking for their player of that card. And then you get people who see the card in other aspects, and then they want it. So it's like that domino effect, and it branches out where one person can create just drive for a card just by bringing it to the spotlight.
Yeah, if only there was a website, Rodney, where we could find information about cards from the 90s and their insert rates and things like that. Do you know anything about that?
No. Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, Baseball Cardpedia is actually a fantastic resource just for the people getting back in the hobby, because, or even just the ones who collected in the 90s and just didn't know like the exact detail because they didn't go into that much description in a Beckett or on a box that you would buy. And it's a valuable resource that I think is also that's another good reason that I think has allowed the 90s market to stay relevant, is because you have a reference to go back and find out more about, hey, what is the deal with the 97 Pacific Kramer's Choice cards? And then you get to read about it. But another part about what you're saying, both of you are talking about the impact that people have just by talking about it, and like saying, oh, like, remember this card, these cards are these are really hot right now. And if you don't, and let's say that you have to back up the data to back that up, that's good. But that's the good. You also have the bad. I know on Blowout, the basketball market has a lot of, on Blowout forums, the basketball 90s market has a lot of people, not just 90s, but modern. They have people who are seen as trying to really hype up their cards just so that they can pump and dump them. And what we talk about, it's more of like, we're doing this, because we want to share information with others who are willing to listen. But at the same time, yeah, it does have that impact. And then I think I've referenced, both of us have referenced like the 90s basketball market. And I think another big impact or reasoning for the drive is related to just simple economics. You have supply and your demand. And the 90s supply is always going to be there because there's nothing from the 90s that is, you see it reproduced in modern days now, whether it's a car design or companies do retro sets that redo the PMGs because they're so popular. Or
Topps Tech. I noticed they're doing like Topps is redoing their tech thing. Yeah.
Label. And when you have a lot of people who just have that demand, you're going to have the people who, change the market, because over time they're going to want a card as years get past from the 90s. But then when you have new people entering the market, whether that's people who grew up in the 2000s or 2010s, they're like, oh, who's like Frank Thomas? I see him on the Nugenix commercials. Who is this guy? And then you learn about him, and he's like, oh, he's a Hall of Fame. He was actually not just this guy promoting whatever product it is that Nugenix is. He actually was a legit player, multiple MVP. He was the best player in the American League for a couple of years early in the 90s. And then you also have basketball collectors who are coming over from 90s basketball because they have to deal a lot with these counterfeits and fakes that are coming over from Asia. And recently, within like the past 2-3 years, I've learned a lot from some basketball collectors I know. And they're like, we see the 90s market in baseball, and we see that as so cheap. Dennis Rodman outsells Griffey across the board on any 90s card.
You got to be kidding me. Are you serious?
No joke. I mean, Charles Barkley outsells Griffey too. And I'm not trying to compare Griffey and Barkley. I'm just saying Barkley wasn't the face of the 90s. You can argue who the face of the 90s was. Sosa, McGuire, Griffey, or Bonds. Jeter. Maybe if there's someone else, then hopefully I'm not insulting your.
No, I think that covers the
obviously
5 guys.
Yeah. And Barkley though wasn't the face of basketball in the 90s. It was Jordan. And then Kobe in the late 90s.
Yeah.
When you have all these new collectors that are entering in, that's going to drive up the price. In addition to everything else that we've talked about. The card design, the rarity, people who came from the 90s who now want to spend more money and buy those cards they wanted as a kid. The home run race, eBay, the online forums, Facebook groups, all these things that are still keeping 90s relevant is inching up that demand, and the supply is going to stay the same because they're not producing cards like that anymore.
Well, also, how many of us 90 guys are like vacuums? Like we get a card and then that card is not going anywhere. Like,
exactly.
You see these modern guys are like, oh, I got this card. I'll sell it to you right now. You want to buy it? I'll sell it to you. Whereas us, we're like, I got this card. You'll never see it again because it's going in my box. It's not for sale. Goodbye.
Yeah, well, Ed, I think we could all agree that there's cards on our list that we just have thought, okay, there's 100 copies of this card. Why hasn't it shown up? It's been 3 years, because there's got to be other people like us out there that are saying this card's never going out of this box ever. Yeah. I mean, that's a whole nother talking point. But I did want to make sure we gave ourselves some time. I mean, we've been talking great discussion about the market the 90s cards. And I think we all agreed to find an example or two of some cards that, we wanted to highlight or we might have in our own collections that are kind of reflective of that. Greg, did you have one that you would like to show off here?
So I'm bringing up the Ultra Platinum medallions, and
Nice.
I did a little research, and in 2000, this is 2007. I have a Beckett from 2007. In 2007, a Griffey 97 Platinum medallion booked for $37.50. I looked up what it is now, and it's $50 on Beckett. But I looked at the past sales, and in 2018, a Griffey Platinum sold for $292.
Yep.
$292. The 98 Platinum sold for $425. Beckett says it was $31 in 2007, and they say it's $40 now. That is those cars, the Platinum medallions. They weren't numbered in 97, but supposedly there were 200 of them. And then it went from, I think, 99. They were serial number 2. But this is the 97 one. With this card, why it stands out is because these were actually photo variations. The base was a different picture than the gold and the platinum medallion, which is awesome to me because photo variations now are like so popular. It's like a short print. So this was a 97, like a short print photo variation. It just felt like they were ahead of their time here. One of my favorites, obviously. And then you got the 98, which is a little different. And that is serial number 200. And then one of my favorite cards in my collection is the 99 Ultra Platinum Frank Thomas, which is serial numbered to 99.
Were the 98 99 variations as well? I honestly don't remember.
No, they were not. That was basically just like a refractor version. But I just wanted to showcase just the price difference. It says right now a Griffey is $50 for a 97, and it sells for $292. So I don't know if Beckett's just not keeping up with the prices.
No.
eBay obviously is
They're definitely not.
Yeah.
The platinum medallions have raised so exponentially. I even tracked a 97 Griffey selling for $15 in 2005.
Oh my gosh.
So a 97 Griffey for $15. In 2007, a 98 Griffey went for $92. Today it's $425. And then a 99 Griffey in 2006 sold for $52, and now they're selling for $180. So
yeah.
Well, since we're talking about Griffey, Rodney, do you have anything to say about that? Are you wishing you could go back and go get those cards now?
I mean, all of us wish. I mean, yeah. I wish I could. Yeah. And Greg, you really good points. I did a similar thing where I tracked 3 different tiers of cards, different players, and tracked their percent increase from 2005 to now. And I had Griffey, Jeter, Thomas, Piazza, Juan Gonzalez. So those are like the different, I guess, price tiers that you can of the players. And then within each player, I chose a low tier, insert or parallel that's numbered, a medium tier, and then a high tier. So the example that I used for all these players, because they were in all these sets, the high end tier, I looked at 98 Crusade Purples. The middle tier, I looked at 97 Flair Legacy Row 1 or 2, because the Row Zeros are a premium. And then for the low end tier from the 90s of these players was any like insert from 99 Upper Deck. And for the Purple Crusade, for simplicity purposes, the Griffey in 2005 Purple Crusade numbered to 100 sold for 176. And then in 2010, it was selling for 200. I picked one up in like 2012. And then by 2014, it commanded around like $400. And then 2018, between 2014 and 2018, I think in 2016, right around Griffey's Hall of Fame is when it jumped significantly. Yes, you have the Crusade has the following that it does, almost like a mythical following. but it jumped from 400 to 800. In 2018, it sold for 1250. Like I know of a private sale. I don't know what a Crusade Griffey now purple would sell for. It would probably go for over $1,200.
Yeah.
But that right there is a 710% increase from 2005.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
if I look at, let's say, Frank Thomas, if I look at his price jumps for low, medium, and high tiers from 2005 to 2000 or to the present right now, I have his high end, his Crusade Purple is increased by 470%. His Flair Legacy has increased by 245%. And his 99, any random 99 upper deck insert from number to 100 has jumped by 144%. So these have at least 1.5 to 2 to 3 times to 5 times increase in price from mid 2000s. And that's across the board for a lot of the star players in the 90s.
Yeah.
It's really interesting you bring up Crusades because I have my Beckett in front of me now from the year 2000. And the Crusades are actually priced quite well. I think it depends on the player because I have a Crusade green here that I guess I could show people what a Crusade looks like if nobody's ever seen it. And the camera's not going to do it justice at all. Yeah, it actually looks horrible, to be honest with you. But in 2000, a green, where's Griffey at right here? So a Griffey from 2000 was $150 for the green in the year 2000. And the A-Rod was priced at $100. I got mine for $30. And again, that's a whole nother topic, but eBay, the guy listed it horribly on eBay. So I was very thankful that I was able to snag that. But I think the example that I have that is quite relevant to this discussion is from 1998 Upper Deck. And it's the second game jerseys that they did. And this, I mean, they don't look too fancy or anything. I mean, look at that. A collector nowadays would think this card was pretty boring, right?
Yeah. Wipe ketchup with it.
What's that?
Wipe their ketchup with it, a napkin.
Yeah, exactly. So not only was this card 1 out of 2,500 packs, but in the year 2000, 2 years after it came out, it was valued at $300. That A-Rod was. And I got that for $23. So Rodney and his amazing math skills can probably figure that out real quick, what that percentage drop is. That's significant because you look at a card that, is valued higher and lower, in the 90s, and you see how it's changed. And I think that's, it's really interesting what the cards nowadays have done to jersey cards. I mean, completely decreased their value unless you're talking about maybe Griffey from, that very first set. That card is a spectacular card for sure. But, that's the exception. I think you can get almost any jersey card from the 90s and pay a very fair price for it. Whereas, you want to try to get a Crusade, which I think we would all agree, if anybody listening, go find one of any player that you can and try to snag one because they might be one of the best looking cards from the 90s. Like you said, they have a mythical following. But yeah, I think that's really interesting. I really find that incredible, to be honest. When I got that card for $20, I was shocked. I was like, this has to go for more. And I know none of them ever sell on eBay, but there was just no demand for that card. And for A-Rod at the time, I think his prices are going up. But
yeah. So like the
crazy.
impact, I think like the takeaway that we're all speaking to the impact now of what's happened and then the reasonings for why. The cards from the 90s have jumped 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 times or higher for certain players since they first came out around that time in the mid to late 90s. And new norms, are set every 2 to 4 years. And so that's what Greg and I were alluding to in 2005, and compare that to 2007, 2010, 14, and then now down to present day. And it's almost like you have to be ready for these changes because, again, like I talked about, when you have a product that has already been released, and then you have more people entering the market, it's simple economics. The demand is going to drive up the prices for these. And whether it's a demand for gem copies, PSA or BGS, a demand for refractors. These cards don't necessarily have to be rare, but whatever people are driving the market to do, it's going to cause those increases in prices. And, each passing year, it's going to be harder and harder to find that specific card of your player because chances are that card or multiple versions of that card are locked away in a PC or they're not going to see the secondary market for a long, long time. So then that builds up the momentum of, like for your example, Matt, you can't find an A-Rod Quantum Leap. When that does hit the market, let's say, I don't know the last time it did hit the market.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of people who want that card who collect A-Rod of a Quantum Leap, and that's what you're gonna have to deal with. So.
Right. Well, hey, I'd much rather deal with that than deal with Ken Griffey Jr., if I'm being honest, Rodney. So,
yeah.
I mean, but that's another interesting point. Anybody that's listening to this and say, hey, I want to get into the 90s. I mean, unless you have a large amount of disposable income, the guys that we mentioned are not easy to just kind of jump right into. Jeter, Griffey, A-Rod, Bonds, Frank Thomas. I mean, it'd be better to go for guys like, well, not Tim Salmon, but guys like Tim Salmon.
Well, Salmon, I got the market cornered. Somebody else.
You know, Rusty Greer, but I know a buddy of mine wouldn't like that either.
Rusty Greer fan 19 or whatever, yeah, something like that. I mean, it's amazing though. I mean, there's guys that collect these players that, and up until the 90s, have kind of had a boom in popularity. Nobody cared about these guys. Nobody collected their cards. I mean, even Joey Cora. If I showed you a Joey Cora platinum that I have, you'd be like, "Oh yeah, those platinums are awesome." Back then, nobody could care.
Yeah. Ken Caminiti platinum. I collect Ken Caminiti. Those. Yeah. They're just a market for everything nowadays. It's just player collectors.
Gotcha. That's awesome. Yeah, it's amazing to see how it's definitely picked up for sure. But hey, Rodney, thanks again for hopping on here with us, man. It was so nice to have you be our first guest. You've been definitely helping us out behind the scenes, and hopefully have you on here again in the near future. I know you're going to be famous after this episode because this is 2 podcasts in 1 week. So congratulations.
No, I really appreciate you guys having me on. This is a fun topic to talk about, and of course I'll come on as a guest anytime. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Glad to have you.
Awesome. Well, hey, I hope you guys have a great rest of your weekend, and we look forward to getting the next episode out to everybody in a couple weeks. Hope everybody enjoyed it. Take care.
Bye.